All right, welcome to another deep dive. You're here because you want to get to the heart of the matter quickly, right? No fluff, just the good stuff. And today we are taking a deep dive into a book that is really considered a classic, a foundational text in the world of business. Peter Drucker's The Practice of Management.
That's right. This book, even though it was published way back in the mid-20th century, it really changed the way people thought about management and how to run organizations.
Yeah. Before Drucker, a lot of the management advice and writing that was out there was very, kind of piecemeal. It's like, okay, here's how to communicate better, or here's some tips for the CEO. But Drucker, he really stepped back and looked at the big picture he was interested in. How do you manage a business as a whole? How do you manage the managers within it? And I think maybe even more importantly, he was really focused on how do you manage the worker and the work itself?
Yeah, and his insights were so fundamental and so ahead of their time that many of the concepts we take for granted today really have their roots in Drucker's work. Things like, corporate culture, the importance of setting objectives, even the idea that every business needs a clear purpose. Like, what is this business all about?
Yeah, and we're going to be drawing on excerpts from the book itself, so let's jump right in. One of the first things that struck me when I was reading Drucker was his emphasis on the nature and importance of management. He really saw it as something distinct and vital.
Yeah, he saw management as its own kind of work, a specific function with its own unique set of responsibilities. And at the time, this was really a new way of thinking about it. He was essentially elevating management to the level of a profession.
So it's not just about, who's the boss or who has the authority. It's about having a particular set of skills and accountabilities.
Exactly. And he went even further than that. He really believed that management was kind of the key to economic progress in the modern age, that it was the organ of society that was responsible for, making resources productive and driving economic advancement. So he really put a huge amount of responsibility on the shoulders of managers.
He really saw it as crucial for the future, not just for individual businesses, but for society as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. He said that the competence, the integrity, and the performance of management were crucial for the functioning of, a free society and for, the well-being of the economy.
So anytime a business does anything, it was really management that was the driving force in his view.
Exactly. He said that, a business enterprise only acts through its management, whether it's a huge corporation like U.S. Steel or a nationalized industry like, the British Coal Board, or even a government entity like the post office, or in his time, a Soviet ministry. It's all about management making things happen.
So from making steel to delivering the mail, it all hinges on good management.
That's right. But he was also very clear that the authority of management isn't unlimited. He said that their power really comes from their ability to perform economically. They have the authority to make decisions and take actions that lead to economic results, but they shouldn't, try to overstep those bounds and, try to dictate things in broader society.
So kind of stay in their lane, so to speak.
Exactly. He was wary of management becoming, the most powerful group in society and potentially overreaching and losing their legitimacy, or even, creating conditions that could lead to some kind of dictatorship.
That's an interesting point. So it's about having power, but also understanding the limits of that power.
Yes. And he also made a really important distinction about what managing actually is. He said it's not just about, adapting to circumstances or reacting to events. It's about actively taking action to achieve desired results.
So not just going with the flow, but actually steering the ship.
Exactly. He contrasted this with, the older view of like a trader who's just, responding to market forces, or even, the modern economist's idea of an investor who's, just choosing among existing options. He said management is about making things happen.
Okay, so that's a good foundation for understanding what management is all about. Now let's get into the specifics of how to actually manage a business according to Drucker, and it all starts with understanding the purpose, right?
Right. He starts with a very basic question. What is the purpose of a business? And his answer is very simple: to create a customer.
To create a customer, huh? That's it. I feel like there's got to be more to it than that.
Well, on the surface, it seems simple, but there's actually a lot packed into that statement. He's saying that markets don't just exist naturally. Businesses actually create markets, even if there's a basic human need, like, the need for food during a famine. It only becomes a market when a business steps in and figures out how to provide that food. And what's even more interesting is that he says businesses can actually create wants or desires that didn't exist before through innovation, advertising, and salesmanship.
So it's not just about filling existing needs, but actually shaping the desires of customers.
Exactly. And this leads to his broader concept of marketing. He says that marketing isn't just a department, it's the entire business. Seen from the customer's perspective, it's about understanding what the customer values, what they're willing to pay for, and building the entire business around that.
He used General Electric as an example of a company that was really doing this well.
That's right. He pointed out that General Electric had really integrated marketing into every aspect of their business,
Hmm.
from product design to production to distribution. They understood that the customer's needs should drive everything.
So it's not about, building something and then figuring out how to sell it. It's about starting with the customer and working backwards.
Exactly. And he also talked about the importance of understanding overhead costs and making a distinction between productive overhead, which are things that might cost money up front, but ultimately reduce costs in the long run, like investing in managerial expertise or new technologies, and parasitical overhead, which are costs that don't really add any value to the customer.
So it's about being smart about where you spend your money.
Right, and he connected this to the idea of a company's process mix, which is essentially understanding what a company is good at, what it's not good at. You know, should they make a certain component themselves, or should they buy it from a supplier? Should they assemble the product in-house or outsource it?
Hmm.
Making strategic decisions about how to utilize their resources most effectively.
So it's about knowing your strengths and your limitations.
Exactly. And then, of course, he gets into the topic of profit, and he acknowledges that there's this ongoing debate about whether maximizing profit should be the sole purpose of a business. But he says that there's this required minimum profit that every business needs in order to survive and grow, to cover its risks, and to maintain its ability to create wealth.
Hmm.
So management needs to set profit objectives and have ways to track whether they're meeting them.
So profit isn't necessarily the end goal, but it's definitely a necessary condition for a business to thrive.
Right, and all of this comes back to that fundamental question, what is our business?
Yeah.
And Drucker really believed that this was the most important question for top management to answer, what are we really doing here? Who are our customers? And he said that failing to answer this question clearly and accurately is one of the main reasons why businesses fail.
And he contrasted this with companies like, the early telephone company and Sears, which were really successful because they had a very clear understanding of what their business was.
Right, they knew what they were offering. They knew who their customers were. And that was really the key to their success. And he also said that this question is important even for businesses that might seem like they don't have a lot of control over their output. Like, copper mine, you can't really control the price of copper. But even a company like that has to think about, who are their customers? How are they going to create demand? How are they going to innovate?
So even a copper mine needs to be customer focused.
Exactly. And then he gets into the question of who is the customer. And he says it's not just about who's buying from you right now, but who could potentially be a customer in the future. Where are they? How do they make their purchasing decisions? How can you reach them? He uses the example of a company that makes fuse boxes, and he says, are they selling primarily to electricians or are they selling to homeowners? That's a really important distinction because it's going to affect their entire marketing and distribution strategy.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you really have to understand your target market.
Right. And then the next question is, what does the customer buy? And he says that you have to think beyond just your narrow product category.
Mm-hmm.
If you're selling gas stoves, you're not just competing with other gas stove manufacturers. You're competing with all the other ways that people can cook food, electric ovens, microwaves, outdoor grills. You have to really understand the need that you're fulfilling.
So competition can come from a lot of different places.
Exactly. And finally, he emphasizes the importance of anticipating changes in the market. Things like economic conditions, consumer tastes, new technologies, new business models. All of these things can have a huge impact on what customers want and how they buy. And he says that competition has to be defined from the customer's perspective. What are the alternatives that they're considering? And how can you stay ahead of the curve?
So it's not enough to just focus on what you're doing right now. You have to be constantly thinking about how the market is changing and how you can adapt.
Exactly. All right, so we've talked about managing the business itself, but what about managing the people who work in the business? Drucker has a lot to say about that as well.
And he starts with the managers themselves, right?
Yeah, he makes the interesting observation that, while there's been a lot of focus on downward communication, how managers communicate with their employees, the reality is that most managers are actually much more concerned with upward communication. How do they communicate with their boss?
Makes sense. Everyone wants to look good in the eyes of their superiors.
Right. He says that even company presidents, they're more worried about their board of directors than they are about their vice presidents. And this pattern kind of repeats itself all the way down the organizational ladder.
Hmm.
So he says that any discussion of, human organization really has to start with how managers are managed.
So, kind of flip the script. Instead of starting with the frontline workers, start with the people who manage those workers.
Exactly. And to illustrate this point, he uses the example of the Ford Motor Company under Henry Ford. And he talks about how Ford was initially incredibly successful. He revolutionized the auto industry, but then the company went through a period of decline, and then it recovered. And Drucker says that one of the key reasons for this decline was that Ford refused to delegate any real authority to his managers.
Oh, so he was a real control freak.
He basically wanted everybody to be a skilled technician, and he paid them very well, but he didn't really see the need for managers. He wanted to make all the decisions himself.
Sounds like that would create a lot of bottlenecks.
It did. His top executives were basically just glorified assistants, carrying out his orders. And this created a climate of mistrust and fear within the company. Drucker actually says that there was even like a secret police operating within Ford that was, spying on employees and looking for conspiracies.
Wow, so a real lack of trust and empowerment at the management level.
Exactly. And he contrasted this with the later turnaround at Ford, when they finally started to delegate more authority and empower their managers. And he said that this was really the key to their recovery.
So a healthy organization needs empowered managers.
That's right. Okay, so how does this tie into Drucker's ideas about setting objectives and maintaining control within an organization?
Well, this brings us to his concept of management by objectives and self-control. And he really believed that a business should function as a team, with everyone working towards a common goal, and with each manager having a clear understanding of their role in achieving that goal.
He was very critical of what he called management by drive, which is essentially just, pushing people harder without really giving them any clear direction or objectives. And he said that this kind of management leads to a lot of wasted effort and misdirected energy.
So it's not just about working hard, it's about working smart.
Exactly. And he proposed this alternative approach called management by objectives, where each manager is responsible for setting their own objectives for their unit in consultation with their superiors. So it's not just top-down directives, it's a collaborative process where everyone is involved in setting goals and figuring out how to achieve them.
So there's a sense of ownership and buy-in from all levels of management.
Exactly. And to make this work effectively, he said that you need clear ways to measure performance. You need to be able to track progress against those objectives. And he said these measurements don't have to be, perfectly precise or quantitative, but they have to be clear, simple, relevant to the goals, and reliable.
So you need some kind of scorecard to keep track of how things are going.
That's right. And he also cautioned against relying too heavily on reports and procedures. He said that these things should be kept to a minimum and they should be as simple as possible and only used when they actually save time and effort.
So don't get bogged down in bureaucracy.
Exactly. And he even tells this story about a plant manager who ran a very profitable operation but didn't keep track of all his overhead costs in, meticulous detail.
Yeah.
He just had a general sense of where the money was going, and that was enough.
Wow. So sometimes less is more.
That's right. And finally, he talks about this idea of team tasks. For those projects that are too big for any one person to handle, but that also can't be easily divided up into individual jobs. He uses the analogy of a scientific paper with multiple authors, where each person contributes their expertise, but they're all ultimately responsible for the final product.
So it's about collaboration and shared responsibility.
Exactly. All right, so we've talked about structures and objectives, but Drucker also recognized that there's this intangible aspect to organizations, what he called the spirit of an organization.
This is kind of like what we would call corporate culture today, right?
Yes, exactly. And he believed that management has a responsibility to actively cultivate a positive and productive work environment. And he outlines 5 key areas for doing this. The first is having high performance requirements. Setting the bar high and rewarding people who meet those expectations.
So setting a high standard and recognizing achievement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The second is not penalizing mistakes.
Yeah.
He actually says that he would be wary of promoting someone to a top leadership position who hadn't made any significant mistakes along the way, because it means they haven't learned from their mistakes.
Interesting. So mistakes are actually valuable learning opportunities.
Exactly. The third area is dealing with consistently poor performers.
Yeah.
And he says that, while you have to have some compassion for people, you also have to be willing to let them go if they're not meeting the standards.
Tough, but necessary sometimes.
Yes. And the fourth area is providing professional recognition and incentives for professional employees.
Yeah.
Recognizing that not everyone is motivated by the same things and that you need to tailor your rewards to the individual.
So understanding the different needs and motivations of your employees.
Exactly. And finally, he emphasizes the importance of a fair and transparent promotion system based on merit, where people are promoted based on their performance and not on, favoritism or politics.
So creating a level playing field?
Exactly. He also talks about the importance of getting multiple opinions when you're making decisions about managers, things like dismissals, demotions, salary changes, those kinds of things. He says that those decisions are too important to be left to the judgment of a single individual.
So checks and balances at the management level.
Right, and perhaps most importantly, he stresses the absolute necessity of integrity in managers. He says that this is the foundation of a healthy organizational culture, and that if managers don't have integrity, their subordinates will quickly lose respect for them and for the organization as a whole.
So character counts.
Absolutely.
All right.
All right, so moving on up the organizational chart. Drucker has some interesting things to say about the role of the chief executive and the board of directors.
The people at the very top, what are his key insights there?
Well, he says that the chief executive has a number of crucial responsibilities. They have to think strategically about the future of the business. They have to set objectives. They have to make the key decisions. They have to communicate those decisions effectively. They have to educate their managers. They have to set up systems for measuring performance. And they have to constantly be reviewing and revising those objectives.
Sounds like a pretty demanding job.
It is. And he acknowledges that the job is becoming increasingly complex, especially in larger organizations. And he even suggests that, in some cases, it might be necessary to have a team of people at the top rather than just a single chief executive.
So more of a collaborative leadership model.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He talks about the idea of a team of equals at the top, where each person has their own area of expertise, but they all work together as a team.
So kind of like a cabinet in a government.
Exactly. And he also talks about the importance of the board of directors. And he says that they have a very important role to play in overseeing the company and making sure that it's being run in the best interest of the shareholders. But he says that in recent years, the board of directors has kind of lost its way and has become too focused on, day-to-day operations and not enough on long-term strategy.
So they need to take more of a big picture view.
Exactly. He says that the board should be composed primarily of outsiders, people who aren't involved in the day-to-day running of the company and who can therefore bring a fresh perspective and ask the tough questions.
So independent oversight is really important.
Yes. All right. So another key topic that Drucker covers is the development of managers. And he says that this is something that requires systematic effort from the organization. You can't just, hope that people will develop into good managers on their own.
So it's not just about, throwing them in the deep end and seeing if they can swim.
Right. He says that the organization has a responsibility to provide opportunities for managers to learn and grow, things like training programs, mentoring job rotations, those kinds of things.
So creating a culture of learning and development.
Exactly. And he says that this is important not just for the future of the organization, but for the present as well. You need managers who are able to understand and implement the decisions that are being made today.
So investing in your people is an investment in the success of the business.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So all of this leadership and management takes place within some kind of organizational structure. So what are Drucker's thoughts on organization structure?
Well, he's very clear that organization is a means to an end, right?
Absolutely. He says that the purpose of organization is to enable the business to achieve its objectives. It's not about creating a beautiful org chart. It's about creating a structure that allows the company to perform effectively. And he says that the starting point should be asking the question, what is our business? And what should it be in the future?
So structure follows strategy.
Exactly. And he says that decision-making should be pushed down to the lowest possible level in the organization. The people who are closest to the action should be the ones making the decisions. But he also says that you have to make sure that everyone is aligned with the overall goals and objectives of the company.
So decentralization, but with alignment.
Right. And he uses the example of the railroad engineering function to illustrate this point. He says that traditionally, the engineering function was very centralized with all the decisions being made at the top. But this created a lot of problems because the engineers at the top didn't really understand the needs of the people on the ground. So he said that you need to decentralize the engineering function and give more authority to the engineers who are actually working on the tracks.
So empower the people who are closest to the problem.
Exactly. And he also cautions against creating unnecessary layers of management.
Mm.
He says that you should only have as many managers as you absolutely need, and that each manager should have a clear and distinct role.
So keep it simple and streamlined.
That's right. And he also critiques the traditional functional organization structure,
Hmm.
where you have departments for marketing, production, finance, etc. And he says that this structure can create a lot of silos and make it difficult for people to see the big picture.
So breaking down those silos is important.
Right. He says that for larger companies, a better approach is often what he calls federal decentralization, which is essentially organizing the company into autonomous business units.
Hmm.
Like General Motors, they have their different divisions for Chevrolet, Buick, Cadillac, and each division operates as its own separate business.
So creating smaller, more nimble units within the larger organization.
Exactly. And he also talks about the importance of having a clear understanding of the relationship between these different units. How do they interact with each other? How do they share information? How do they coordinate their activities?
So it's not just about creating these separate units, it's about making sure that they work together effectively.
Right. And finally, he says that all of this organization structure is really just a means to an end. The ultimate goal is to create a structure that allows the company to achieve its objectives.
So structure should serve the strategy.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about managing the business, managing the managers.
Hmm.
Now let's talk about managing the workers and the work itself.
And this is an area where Drucker really shines. I think he has some really insightful and humane things to say about how to manage people effectively.
Yeah, he really believes that managing worker and work is its own distinct management function. And he uses the example of IBM as a company that was doing this really well. He talks about how they had a strong focus on respecting the individual employee, setting high-performance standards, carefully matching the job to the person, providing a lot of information to their employees, promoting from within whenever possible, and giving thorough job instruction.
So it's about creating a supportive and empowering environment for workers.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with the more traditional approaches to personnel management, things like personnel administration, which he says is often very reactive, just dealing with problems as they arise, in human relations, which he says is often too focused on, eliminating negative factors in the workplace rather than creating positive motivation.
So it's not just about putting out fires, it's about creating a positive work environment.
Exactly. And he also acknowledges the contributions of scientific management, the idea of systematically studying and improving work processes. But he says that scientific management often goes too far. It tries to reduce human beings to machines, and it doesn't take into account the importance of things like motivation and job satisfaction.
So there's a human element that can't be ignored.
Right. And he advocates for this more holistic approach, which he calls human organization for peak performance. And this approach is really about designing jobs that are inherently motivating and organizing people in ways that allow them to use their skills and talents to their fullest potential.
And he gives examples of companies that were doing this well, like the telephone company and some of the aircraft manufacturers.
Right. He talks about how the telephone installers, they had very clear standards for how they were supposed to do their job, but they also had a lot of autonomy, and they were expected to use their judgment and problem-solving skills. And he says that this made the job more interesting and more motivating. And he also talks about how in the aircraft factories, they were experimenting with different ways of organizing work teams. And they were finding that when they gave teams clear goals and feedback and allowed them to organize their own work, they were often able to exceed the performance targets that were set by the industrial engineers.
So it's about giving people ownership and responsibility.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes the importance of placement and
Yeah.
making sure that people are in the right jobs and that they have the skills and abilities to do those jobs effectively. And he says that this is an ongoing process. You have to constantly be evaluating your people and making sure that they're in the right roles.
So it's not just about hiring the right people, it's about making sure that they're in the right jobs.
Exactly. And he also talks about the importance of setting clear objectives for individual workers, and not just broad output targets, but specific goals that they can work towards. And he says that this is especially important in today's world, where work is becoming increasingly complex and knowledge-based.
So giving people a clear sense of purpose and direction.
Right. And he also points out the demotivating effect of poor planning. When people are constantly being rushed and they don't have the time or the resources to do their jobs properly, he says that this creates a lot of frustration and resentment.
So good planning is essential for a productive and motivated workforce.
Absolutely. And he says that a sense of responsibility comes from having clear objectives, clear standards, and access to the information that you need to do your job. And he also talks about the importance of managerial vision.
Hmm.
The manager has to be able to paint a picture of the future and inspire people to work towards that vision.
So it's not just about telling people what to do, it's about giving them a reason to do it.
Exactly. And he uses the example of the C&O Railroad, where they were renovating one of their shops, and they involved the workers in the planning process. And this led to a lot of innovative ideas and improvements that the managers had never even thought of.
So tapping into the collective wisdom of the workforce.
Exactly. He also talks about the importance of providing predictable income and employment security. He says that this is one of the best ways to reduce resistance to the idea of profit. A lot of workers see profit as something that just goes to the owners. But if they know that their jobs are secure and that their incomes are stable, they're more likely to be supportive of the company's efforts to make a profit.
So aligning the interests of the workers with the interests of the company.
Right. And he also talks about the importance of the supervisor's role. He says that the supervisor is really a key player in managing worker and work, and that they need to have the authority and the resources to do their job effectively. And he also emphasizes the importance of training supervisors and giving them opportunities for advancement.
So investing in your supervisors is just as important as investing in your workers.
Exactly. And finally, he talks about the different kinds of workers that exist in organizations. He says that there are managers, there are ordinary workers, and then there are these individual professional contributors, people like engineers, scientists, researchers. And he says that these professional workers need to be managed differently than ordinary workers. They need more autonomy, they need to be given more challenging work, and they need to be recognized for their contributions.
So a tailored approach to managing different types of workers.
Exactly. All right, so moving on to the last section of the book, the manager and decision-making.
What are Drucker's key insights here?
Well, he starts by highlighting two key tasks for managers. The first is to create an integrated whole out of the various parts of the organization, to make sure that everyone is working together towards a common goal. And the second is to balance the immediate needs of the business with the long-term goals.
So short-term versus long-term thinking?
Exactly. And he says that while managers often perform a lot of non-management tasks, things like attending meetings, writing reports, etc., their core work is really about analyzing, organizing, motivating, communicating, measuring, and developing people.
So it's about leading and managing people.
Right. And he challenges the idea that the most important quality in a manager is liking people. He says that that's certainly important, but it's not enough. You also need to be able to make tough decisions. You need to be able to hold people accountable, and you need to be able to prioritize the needs of the business over the needs of individuals.
So sometimes you have to be the bad guy.
That's right. And he also emphasizes the importance of the manager's relationship with their superiors and peers. He says that this is just as important as their relationship with their subordinates.
So it's about managing relationships at all levels.
Exactly. And when it comes to decision-making, he says that the first step is to clearly define the problem that you're trying to solve. Not just the symptoms, but the underlying cause. And he cautions against rushing to a solution. He says that it's important to take the time to really understand the problem before you start trying to fix it.
So don't just jump to conclusions.
Right. And he also says that it's important to define the boundary conditions for the solution. What are the constraints that you're working within? And he stresses the importance of developing multiple alternative solutions. Don't just settle for the first idea that comes to mind.
So explore your options.
Exactly. And he says that a decision is only effective if it leads to action. You can make the best decision in the world, but if nobody does anything about it, it's not going to matter. So communication and motivation are really key parts of decision making.
So it's about getting people to buy into the decision and take action.
Exactly. And finally, he talks about the dangers of sub-optimization, which is essentially solving a problem in one area in a way that creates problems in another area. And he stresses the importance of understanding the basic decision-making process, defining the problem, analyzing the problem, developing alternative solutions, making a decision, and then taking action.
So a systematic approach to decision-making.
Exactly. All right, so finally, let's talk about the manager of tomorrow.
What does Drucker see as the challenges and opportunities for managers in the future?
Well, he says that the demands on managers are going to continue to increase. The world is becoming more complex, more competitive, more globalized, and managers are going to need to be more adaptable, more strategic, more innovative, and more collaborative.
So the bar is being raised.
It is. And he says that one of the key challenges for managers is going to be dealing with the rapid pace of technological change. New technologies are constantly emerging, and managers need to be able to understand these technologies and how they can be used to improve their businesses.
So staying ahead of the curve.
Exactly. And he also talks about the importance of lifelong learning. Managers need to be constantly updating their skills and knowledge. And he says that this is going to require a shift in mindset. In the past, people would get a degree and then they would go to work for a company and they would stay there for their entire career. But in the future, people are going to have to be much more mobile. They're going to have to be willing to change jobs, change careers, even change industries.
So a more flexible and adaptable workforce.
Exactly. And he also talks about the increasing importance of the knowledge worker, people who work with their minds rather than their hands. And he says that these knowledge workers are going to be the key to success in the future. So managers need to learn how to manage them effectively.
So managing knowledge workers is going to be a critical skill for managers in the future.
Absolutely. And finally, he talks about the growing importance of social responsibility. He says that businesses are increasingly being held accountable for their impact on society, and that managers need to be aware of this,
Yeah.
and they need to be proactive in addressing social issues.
So businesses need to be good citizens.
Exactly.
Mm.
And he concludes by saying that the public good must ultimately rest on private virtue.
Mm.
Businesses need to be ethical, they need to be responsible, and they need to be committed to doing the right thing.
So it's not just about making a profit, it's about making a positive contribution to society.
Exactly.
Well, that was a great deep dive into the practice of management. Some really insightful and timeless advice from Peter Drucker. What are your key takeaways from the book?
Well, I think one of the most important things that Drucker emphasizes is the importance of having a clear purpose. Every business needs to know why it exists, what it's trying to achieve, and who it's serving. And this purpose needs to be communicated clearly to everyone in the organization.
Yeah, and he really stresses the importance of the customer, right?
Absolutely. He says that the purpose of a business is to create a customer, and that everything the business does should be focused on meeting the needs of its customers.
And he also talks about the importance of innovation, constantly looking for new and better ways to do things.
Yes. He says that innovation is the specific tool of entrepreneurs, the means by which they exploit change as an opportunity for a different business or a different service.
And it has a lot to say about managing people effectively, empowering them, giving them clear objectives, holding them accountable, creating a positive work environment.
Yes, and he stresses the importance of developing managers, investing in their training and giving them the opportunity to grow and develop their skills.
And he's also very clear about the importance of social responsibility. Businesses need to be good citizens and they need to be committed to making a positive impact on society.
Absolutely. I think those are some of the key takeaways from the book.
Well, that's great food for thought for our listeners as they navigate the complexities of the modern business world. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Hey, it was a pleasure.